Paul's letter to the Galatians. The letter was written by Paul and is typically dated about AD 56. The place of composition was perhaps Ephesus or Corinth. The audience was the churches of Galatia, perhaps southern Galatia, a Roman province containing the towns of Lystra, Iconium, and Derbe. The purpose of the letter was to refute opponents who advocated circumcision and to demonstrate that Jew and Gentile are equally saved by faith in Jesus' redemptive power. Some themes of the letter include Paul's argument that by the works of the law no one is justified. The works of the law is the strictly Jewish portion of the law: dress, haircut, diet, circumcision, etc. So in other words, identifying as a Jew is not what justifies you before God, as many in the Galatian church had been claiming. Chapter 1 begins with an introduction. Paul claims that he is an apostle sent not by humans but by Christ and by God the Father, and that God raised Jesus from the dead. Paul offers his greeting. The letter then quickly jumps into Paul's denunciation of the Galatians. Why is Paul in shock? Well, the Galatians have quickly abandoned the life lived in Christ. They've turned to a false gospel. They've been thrown into confusion by those perverting Christ's gospel. Paul says, all who preach false gospels be damned. Even if an angel preaches it, even if we apostles preach it. And why is Paul not concerned with pleasing these people? Well, because if he were still trying to please people, he would not be a servant of Christ. Paul then gets personal and he provides a defense of his own apostleship. The gospel Paul preaches is not of human origin. He didn't receive it from some guy. He wasn't taught it. He received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. Paul emphasizes that his ministry is independent of the Jerusalem apostles, and he demonstrates this by discussing his own conversion and his early years as a Christian. Paul was originally a Judaizer. He persecuted the church and tried to destroy it. But God set Paul apart, and he called Paul to preach Christ among the Gentiles. In Paul's first response to his call, he did not consult any human being. He did not go up to Jerusalem to meet the first apostles, but he went into Arabia and later returned to Damascus. 3 years after Paul received Christ's call, he went up to Jerusalem to meet Cephas, or Peter. He stayed with Cephas, Peter, for 15 days. He didn't meet with the other apostles. He did meet with Jesus' brother James. He then went to Syria and Cilicia. The churches didn't really know much about Paul, but they knew that he used to persecute the church, but now supported it, so they praised God because of Paul. In chapter 2, Paul says that he was confirmed by the Jerusalem apostles, but then he talks about how they treated his disciple Titus. 14 years later, Paul went back to Jerusalem with Barnabas. He took Titus with him. He went in response to a revelation. He met privately with the church leaders. He presented to them the gospel that he had preached to the Gentiles. He did this to make sure he was not running his race in vain. But then there arose an issue of circumcision. A group of false believers had infiltrated the church in order to force the Gentiles into the rite of circumcision. Paul says that Titus, who was Greek, was not compelled by them, and that Paul and his companions did not give in for a moment. Why? To preserve a pure gospel to the Galatians. Paul says that those folks who are held in high esteem don't matter to him because God doesn't favor them over anyone else, and they added nothing to Paul's message. Paul then lists the 3 pillars of the church. They are James, Jesus' brother, Peter, and John. They recognized that Paul's mission to Gentiles was as legitimate as Peter's mission to Jews. They agreed that Paul and Barnabas should go to the uncircumcised Gentiles, and they themselves to the circumcised Jews. All they asked was that Paul and Barnabas continue to remember the poor, which was what Paul wanted in the first place. Paul then demonstrated the independence of his ministry by illustrating his own rebuke of Peter's hypocrisy. Paul says that he opposed Cephas, Peter, when he came to Antioch. Why? Because when certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles, but when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy even Barnabas was led astray. Paul said to Cephas, Peter, in front of them all, "You are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs?" Paul says that we Jews know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, and a person is justified by faith in Jesus Christ. Paul contrasts death in law versus life in Christ, saying, "For through the law I died to the law so that I might live for God. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness could be gained through the law, Christ died for nothing."